Well, my apologies, but there's been a fatal accident on I-24, and what began as a leisurely Sunday morning has become a very hectic one. We had to leave I-24. They blocked off all the entrances. Carol, somewhere on your system is a voicemail. You did get it? Okay. Well, in that case, you know where I've been for the last few minutes, and my wife Gail, who was driving, was under pressure as well. Interesting when you get into the back roads off I-24. A little bit of history on the way too, and some very questionable restrooms. Well, in any event, we're here, and I look forward to this very much. And join me, if you will, in a word of prayer. Most gracious God, we thank you for your invitation to be here this morning, and we thank you that we've been able to accept it. So our prayer now is that you will bless this gathering, that you will give us, through all of the ways at your disposal, a true means of grace. And we pray this in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. Everybody should have a copy of this worksheet, and that's the theme that the presentation will follow. It gives you the opportunity to make notes, write questions, and what I'm hoping to do is to get through with this and leave some time for general questions afterwards. The whole theme of small groups is very much on the agenda of the church and has been now for quite some time. In fact, when I first began studying the early Methodist class meeting, which was way back in the mid-70s, someone had already written a history of small groups. And in fact, small groups have almost become an end in themselves. Somebody once pointed out that we worship a God who is a small group. And when you pause and think, well, yes, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, that figures. A friend of mine once at Perkins School of Theology said he'd found a new definition of eternal punishment: to go into a small group and discuss it forever. But in fact, small groups are a social reality. And the church has discovered this over the years in all sorts of ways. What I want to do is to put the early Methodist class meeting in the context of the church. Because Methodism is now a church. It began as a movement, but it's now a church. And if we can understand how these groups fit into the nature of the church and the function of the church, then we'll have a better sense of where we stand in Christian tradition. We're meeting here today not simply as a congregation. We're meeting here as a congregation of a church that is 2,000 years old. And if we can understand some of what has gone on before, then I think we're better able to understand what's happening right now. And a lot is happening right now, not least because of the way in which we now know the place of planet Earth in a vast cosmos. If we thought God was powerful before the Hubble telescope, we now realize God is infinitely more powerful than we could have imagined. Either God has created this entire universe with billions of stars, in billions of galaxies, in billions of clusters of galaxies. And if you think about it, that makes the coming of Jesus Christ even more dramatic and more important. That the creator of all of this should pick this planet to come in person. And moreover, to have allowed this planet to go wrong. And we have gone seriously wrong. A lot of planet Earth is good. A lot of planet Earth and its history has been very, very bad. I was born in 1938, the year the Jewish Holocaust really began to get some traction. And all you have to do is to look in the annals of the Nazi Holocaust, and you see how far we've gone wrong. Or for that matter, look into the annals of slavery and see how far we went wrong. So we are a redeemed planet, but let's never forget our little microscopic place in this great cosmos. Let's go first of all to our Protestant tradition. Protestantism began, of course, with the Reformation. It changed the church forever, because initially the church, particularly the Roman Church, though also the Eastern Church, consisted of a very authoritarian structure. In the Western Church, headed by the Pope, and then cardinals, and then bishops, and then priests, and people came under their authority. And it was a very big authority. There were protests against it. In the Middle Ages, we find that there were lay movements that came about to question the authority of priests and popes. But the big one, of course, we all know about, the Reformation of the 16th century. And the Reformation brought us a new kind of church. There were, of course, theological differences. In the Reformation, one of the main theological emphases was Calvinism, and this insisted upon God being all-powerful. But there was also something called Arminianism, which allowed for human freedom and response. Now, Carol gave a presentation last week that gives you all of the background to this, and which I found myself very stimulating and informative. What I want to do today is to look at the implications of all of this for the church. Under Rome, priests were firmly in control. In Protestantism, something happened that we should never forget. The church became a partnership between clergy and laity. That's a very different way of looking at who we are as the church. Because now that laity were having a say, the major unit of the church became not the priesthood and the sacraments and the Pope and everything that went with that. Instead, the basic unit of the church became congregations, in which lay people had a big say. Now, our particular tradition, the Methodist tradition, goes back to the English Reformation. And that's when Henry VIII, one of the most powerful monarchs that the United Kingdom has ever had, and also one of the most disreputable. I mean, we're talking about presidents who go through wives. My goodness, Henry VIII went through twice as many and dispatched 2 of them. But Henry VIII also became head of the church in England, not the Pope. That's a big difference. And to this day, on British coins, you see 2 things. You see, first of all, Ind Imp, but you also see what is standing for the head of the church. The king, the queen, is the head of the church, still today. This makes, of course, Protestantism the major tradition in which we find ourselves. It didn't remain just the Church of England, of course. You had further divisions, Presbyterians, Congregationalists, Baptists. But Methodists came later. They became part of the Church of England. The Methodist Church was not born in England. It was born here, in America. In England, Methodism began as societies within the Church of England. Back to small groups, you see. If you have a big church, you need smaller groups in order to have a true identity. But in England, Methodism simply consisted of societies. We're going to look at that more in a moment. It became a church when John Wesley gave authority by ordaining some of his preachers to come to this country with the authority to ordain American preachers. Not just preaching, but ordained preaching. That happened here, Christmas Conference, 1784. What Wesley hadn't bargained for, that the following day they would also create bishops. And Methodism never had bishops, still doesn't in a lot of the world. People have questioned that. And of course, we've just had annual conferences where who presides? The bishop presides. So the Methodist Church is in fact an American church, even though there are different branches of Methodism elsewhere in the world. Now, when you've got a big organization, then sub-organizations tend to come about. And there's a phrase, you have it on your worksheet, ecclesiola in ecclesia. Little church in the big church. Methodist societies is one example. But the example we're going to look at are class meetings. Let's look first of all, though, at the Methodist societies. These were not originally Methodist. These were societies in the Church of England that came together to live a more meaningful and committed Christian life. And these societies, moreover, were very heavily involved in social reform. Maybe you've heard of SPCK, the Society for the Promotion of Christian Knowledge. That became a worldwide network of Church of England societies. Or SPG, the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel. That was the society that sponsored the Wesley brothers to come over to Georgia, where they were missionaries for a while. These Anglican societies still were thriving when Wesley came on the scene. And what Wesley did, in fact, was to not only affiliate with these societies, but sometimes take them over. Because sometimes societies had their day and then began to lose their energy. He came in and said, well, why don't we just make them Methodist societies, which they did. But within these societies, Methodism made a big difference. Two key differences. The first was field preaching, taking the gospel in the open air to people who otherwise would not have heard it. The Church of England looked down on this. They felt that to preach in the open air was scandalous. It cheapened the gospel. But Wesley himself felt that way initially. And then, on a certain day, April the 2nd, 1739, something happened. Now, there's a big day in Methodism, we remember, May the 24th, 1738. Anyone know what happened then? That's when John Wesley felt his heart strangely warmed. It's regarded as his conversion in many ways. May the 24th, 1738, in a society in Aldersgate Street in London. But the following year, April the 2nd, 1739, as he puts in his journal, I submitted to be more vile and preached in the open air. Now, when you get back home, you might want to look this up. It's in 2 Samuel chapter 6 and verse 22. And it's where King David is bringing the Ark of the Covenant back into Jerusalem. A big celebration. The Ark had been hidden away for a long time because people didn't feel that they could trust the king with the Ark. But now David was king, and he was bringing the Ark back into Jerusalem. It says he led the procession, dancing before the Lord, wearing only an ephod. Now, there are two kinds of ephod in the Old Testament. One is what the high priest would wear on making a sacrifice. The other is a loincloth, the minimum for decency. And that's what David was wearing, a minimum for decency. Well, His wife, Michael, the daughter of King Saul, upbraided him. "Shameless fellow," she said, "exposing yourself like that in front of my handmaidens," who, by the way, were probably copping a good look because they were seeing more king than ever they'd seen before. But his point was this: even if it makes me look ridiculous and contemptible, I will follow the command of God. And that's how Wesley put it when he began to preach in the field. I will be contemptible in the sight of the world in order to take the gospel to people who otherwise would never hear it. And that was what really began the Methodist movement. Now, the other thing that was very distinctive about the Wesleyan movement initially was the doctrine of the new birth, being born again. There's a sermon in Wesley's collection called "The Great Privilege of Those Born of God." In it, he gives, in my view, one of the most remarkable insights into being born again. It's not a case of answering an appeal from an evangelist who loves to see people coming forward to get changed. Wesley says it happens in a much more subtle and yet meaningful way. The best way to understand spiritual birth is to look at natural birth. He has this remarkable image. By the way, it probably was because he grew up in a household where his mother gave birth to 19 children. They didn't all survive. In those days, childbirth often led to early child death. But Charles and John did survive, of course, and must remember what it must have been like to be in a household where the birth of a child was a common occurrence. Because Wesley talks about a baby in the womb as having eyes that do not see, ears that do not hear, lungs that do not breathe. Then there's a transition. And the transition is a radical one. The baby comes into the world. The eyes begin to see. The ears begin to hear. The lungs, my goodness, begin to work. You see his point? A mysterious beginning, growth in the womb, the radical transition, and then growth after the transition. And the growth after the transition is even more important than in the womb. Because, as we all know, a baby who does not grow does not survive. I sometimes think of this when we have confirmation. Because you and I are the mother, spiritually, of young men and women who are confirmed. Let me ask this. Can you as the church remember laboring over the birth of a new Christian? It's a laborious thing to give birth. The church should labor over giving birth to new Christians. And it's not that we cause the new birth. That is God's work. But it does mean we should labor to make the birth possible. Now that's how Wesley viewed the Christian life. How he viewed the new birth. Today, unfortunately, because being born again is often a catchphrase, we tend to put it to one side. The first church I served, man came up to me and said, "Well, preacher," this, by the way, was in the Southern Illinois Conference in East St. Louis. And East St. Louis in the 70s was Ferguson, Missouri. It was one of those inner city situations. He said, "Preacher, you need to know I've been born again 5 times. And each time was better than the last." It's not that kind of caricature that we're talking about here. We're talking about a new spiritual life. And we could put it this way. In the Wesleyan tradition, to be born again means that we have been twice born. Our faith is not simply a religious aspect to our natural life. It is a whole new life. But it is birthed and it grows in the community called church. Well now, with all of this, how did it all happen in the Methodist societies that we have class meetings? You might find it rather comforting, as I have from time to time, to find that this tremendous spiritual rebirth began over a building debt. Listen, there were two of these societies in Bristol, at Nicholas Street and Baldwin Street, who needed a new meeting place. They'd gotten very big. And these were two of the societies that Wesley had aligned himself with. So, being an ordained cleric of the Church of England, he was able to take out a mortgage, which was very difficult to take out in those days, unless you were a moneyed or society-respected person. So, here's a member of the Church of England, ordained. He takes out a mortgage. And then, wouldn't you know, he turned to the societies and said, now, how are you going to pay for it? Well, there was a big discussion. And finally someone said, well, I tell you what, why don't we ask every member in the society to contribute a penny a week? Now, a penny in those days was a large coin the size of a $50, and a penny was a day's wage for a labourer. So it was a sizable amount. In fact, when I was a boy, they still had halfpennies and farthings, which was like an American cent, worth a quarter of a penny. Anyway, it was agreed, all right, let's then collect a penny a week from everybody. Then someone said, but that's all very well, what about those who cannot afford it? A retired sea captain, and all we know about this man is his name. One day a budding PhD is going to find out who he really was and make a name for him or herself. But in any event, all we know so far is Captain Foy, a retired sea captain. Give me 11 names, he said, and I will collect the penny a week from each of them, and I'll put it in for any who don't have it. And a few others said, that's a good idea. Give me 11 names. And before long, the whole society was divided into groups of 12. 11 from whom the penny would be collected, and the 12th would be the person who did the collecting. And these people went round to everybody's home to get the penny. But after a while, this proved to be less than satisfactory. First of all, quite a few of the members of the society were household servants. And the master or mistress of the house didn't like someone knocking on the door and saying, I've come for a penny. And furthermore, they began, unfortunately, to engage in what we might best call church gossip. As they collected the penny, they'd get a story from someone about somebody else. And somebody else would give another story to somebody else. In other words, it was not really a good way of doing it. So instead of going round to collect the penny, why don't we have everyone bring the penny? And that's what began the class meeting. Because when they came together to bring the penny, they also began to engage in sharing, in nurturing one another, and in fact, in finding grace by simply being together. Now, the reason I've given you that narrative is that if we think that somebody back in the 18th century had such a hold on social gathering and social dynamics and well, we're going to have small groups, not at all. It happened in a much more down-to-earth way. Let's clear a mortgage and let's get together. But the class meeting after that became the basic structure of these Methodist societies. And being a basic structure meant that it also drew out new kinds of leadership. Because, as with Captain Foy, the person who was collecting the money quite naturally became the leader of the meeting. And sometimes these meetings would take place at the society house, sometimes in somebody's home. But in bringing the penny, there was a structural strength to the meeting that allowed the freedom to talk about other things, about the spiritual life. The class meeting lasted for well over 2 centuries on both sides of the Atlantic. Today, I suppose, we have the different kind of meeting when we have Sunday school classes. Sunday school classes, by and large, provide wonderful fellowship, good instruction, but they don't provide the accountability that came out of the class meeting. Because John Wesley not only approved of these class meetings and class leaders, he gave them a set of rules. And the rules were the agenda of the class meeting. Now today, when we talk about rules in the church, we tend to take a step backwards. I'm not going to get caught up in this. I'll come to church, of course. I mean, I love to come and worship, and I love the fellowship. But don't hand me a book of rules. I'm afraid, friends, they're in the book of discipline. In fact, there is in the book of discipline a general rule of discipleship. You can look it up. I won't give you the page number now, but I have it here if you'd like it. It's in the latest book of discipline. And the general rule of discipleship says to witness to Jesus Christ in the world and to follow his teachings through acts of compassion, acts of justice, acts of worship, and acts of devotion under the guidance of the Holy Spirit. In fact, you're going to be looking at these in subsequent Sunday mornings. Each of these areas is going to get some attention, because it is a balance between what Wesley called works of mercy and works of piety. The works of mercy are acts of justice and acts of compassion. And do you see the difference there? You can do something compassionate for somebody, but don't ever neglect to ask the question, why do they need my compassion? Justice very quickly then becomes a major factor. Same with worship. Worship is a big corporate event. Devotion is when we are personally relating to God through prayer, through scripture, and through meditation. You see the balance that is kept here. In other words, through the class meeting, Wesley was presenting, and this is why we're called Methodists, presenting a way of living the Christian life that is not left in the hands of powerful priests and bishops, and not even in the hands of pastors, but in the hands of all of us. The other thing that happened, and this of course was very important, and that is that the class leader remained for many years a major office in Methodist churches. The class leader was responsible for the oversight and care of a class of 12 people, including him or herself. Notice how that makes the Christian life more accountable. It means that you don't have to try to figure out for yourself how to live the Christian life. It still is your responsibility and my responsibility. But we've got guidelines. We've got a framework. And we can check and balance all of this as we go through life. When we bring this forward into the church of today, one thing I think is very important to remember, and that is, how did Jesus function? Check all the New Testament passages about Jesus and his disciples. At one time he had 70, until they figured out it was going to cost him too much. And then he was down to 12. And one of those he couldn't finally trust. But what did he do with the people? Oh, golly, they came in their hundreds and thousands. And what did he do with the people? He fed them. He healed them. He taught them. But above all, he loved them. And when some of his disciples wanted to send the children away, God, they're getting in the way. That, by the way, Carol, is why that part of the worship service is so important, and you do it very well. Bring the children. They're important. However, when it came to being his disciple, that was a very direct invitation. Will you follow me? And let me tell you, it's going to cost you. But the privilege will be walking and talking with God incarnate. What did they talk about on those dusty roads? What did they talk about when they were out fishing? What did they talk about at night in Bethany, those wonderful evenings with Mary and Martha? It got very intimate, but not to be exclusive, because Jesus made very clear that he was calling these disciples to help him to reach everyone else. Now, let's pick up where we left the Methodist Church. Congregations, and congregations that were, in effect, being led not only by clergy, but also by laity, by class leaders, and other officers that were called stewards. The main thing was this: lay people were sharing leadership with clergy on a 50-50 basis. So ask, are we doing that today? Well, we have a lot of lay officers, we have lay preachers, we have lay ministers now. But are we really sharing the leadership of congregations in the way that Jesus invited his disciples to share with others? That's the key to Methodism. Because in our congregations, there are ways in which lay people are called to leadership in the same way that clergy are called. And I would have to say, as I look back on my years of ministry, I'm afraid that authority has gravitated too much toward the clergy. The clergy are regarded as being responsible for the life and work of the church, with, of course, the help of the laity. I'd like to rephrase that. Clergy are responsible for the life and work of the church in partnership with the lay leadership of the congregation. That is how the old office of class leader can best function in the church of today. And that leaves time for some of your questions.